Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a huge topic, the constantly changing world of global power. We're going to look at how the rules of the international game have been written, then torn up, and completely rewritten over the past few hundred years. So, let's get right into it and unpack how our world got to where it is today. This is the question at the absolute heart of international politics. Is it one country, a handful of powerful nations, or, and this is a big one, is it possible that nobody's really in charge? Over the next few minutes, we're going to see just how dramatically the answer to that question has changed. All right, so here's our roadmap. We've got 5 parts to our story. First, we'll look at the old European power game and see how it all fell apart. Then, we'll jump into the deep divide of the Cold War, and after that, America's time as the world's only superpower. From there, we'll explore some different ways of actually thinking about the global system. And finally, we'll ask the big question, are we heading into a new Cold War right now? Okay, so let's rewind. Our story starts in a world run by European empires. For centuries, they all played by a specific set of rules. But then came the First World War, and its devastation just completely shattered that system, forcing everyone to wonder if there had to be a better way. So just to get our bearings, take a look at this timeline. We kick things off with the Westphalian Order. That's a long stretch where individual sovereign states were the main players on the world stage. That's followed by the incredibly chaotic interwar period, which leads us right into the 45-year standoff of the Cold War. And that brings us to today, the post-Cold War era. Now, for most of that early period, one single idea was king, the balance of power. You can think of it like a giant, complicated game of chess. The main goal for every country was to make sure no other country got way too powerful. So if one nation, say Napoleonic France, started to dominate, all the others would team up in a coalition to, knock it down a peg and restore the balance. But after the horrors of trench warfare and the incredible loss of life in World War I, this old way of doing things just seemed, barbaric. Leaders like U.S. President Woodrow Wilson started arguing that this endless struggle for power was the actual problem. He talked about a security dilemma. When one country builds up its army for defense, its neighbors get nervous and see it as a threat. So they build up their armies, and it just creates this dangerous, escalating spiral of fear and mistrust. So Wilson had this dream of a peaceful world order, but it didn't last. The League of Nations failed, World War II happened, and what emerged from that wreckage was a completely different global structure. This one wasn't defined by many powers trying to stay in balance, but by just 2. And this is what political scientists call bipolarity. It's a fancy word for a simple idea. After 1945, power wasn't spread out among a bunch of different players anymore. Instead, pretty much the entire world started to orbit around 2 giant competing superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And look, this wasn't just a typical rivalry over land or resources. No, this was a clash of civilizations, really. A fundamental fight over how society itself should be run. On one side, you had the Western Bloc, led by the US, all about liberal democracy and free markets. On the other side, the Eastern Bloc, led by the USSR, pushing for state socialism and centrally planned economies. This ideological fight literally split the planet in 2. And of course, this rivalry had a terrifying military side to it. Both sides poured unbelievable amounts of money into building new ways to deliver nuclear bombs, from bombers to continent-spanning missiles. The competition just kept spiraling into this massive nuclear arms race. And it hit a whole new level in the 80s with Reagan's Star Wars plan, a proposal to shoot down Soviet missiles from space, which you can imagine Moscow saw as a huge, game-changing escalation. For decades, that bipolar world felt like it was set in stone, just frozen in place forever. But then, it ended. And it ended with a speed that shocked just about everyone. When one of those 2 poles collapsed, the entire structure of world politics changed, literally overnight. In 1991, the Soviet Union just disappeared. It ceased to exist. And all of a sudden, there was only one superpower left on the field, the United States. This created what historians call a unipolar moment, a really rare time in history where all the world's power is basically concentrated in the hands of a single country.
So that brings up a really important question. What does a world with just one superpower actually look like? Is it more stable or less? Well, one big idea is something called hegemonic stability theory. It basically argues that the world is more stable when you have a single dominant power, a hegemon, that kind of sets the rules and enforces them for everyone, making sure things like global trade and security keep running smoothly. And for a while, that was the role the US played.
But hang on, is the world really that simple? Is it always just about the power of countries? As globalization kicked into high gear, people started coming up with new ways, new models, to try and make sense of our incredibly complex and interconnected world. Okay, so the old school view is often called the billiards ball model. It sees the world as, well, a collection of states that act like billiard balls. They're these hard-shelled, self-contained units that just bounce off each other in this constant struggle for power and security. In this view, what's happening inside a country doesn't really matter as much as how much power it has compared to its neighbors.
But what if that's just not the whole story anymore? The cobweb model says that billiards' view is totally outdated. It suggests that states aren't these solid, separate things. Instead, we live in this complex web of connections between giant corporations, NGOs, social movements, and even just individuals that slice right through national borders. In this model, a decision made in a corporate boardroom in Tokyo could have a way bigger impact than a treaty signed by politicians in Geneva.
And then there's an even more critical take. Dependency theory throws out the idea of a world of equal states entirely. Instead, it sees one big global system that's structured for exploitation. It describes a wealthy core of nations that pulls in cheap labor and raw materials, think coffee beans or oil, from a poorer periphery. The core then processes those materials into expensive goods, like lattes and gasoline, and sells them back at a huge profit, locking the periphery into a cycle of dependency and inequality. And that brings us right up to today. That unipolar moment seems to be well and truly over. And a lot of people are now arguing that we're drifting into a brand new era of great power competition, one that looks eerily familiar. Some people have started calling this Cold War 2.0, but how does it really stack up against the original? Well, the rivals are different, for starters. It's the US versus China, not the Soviet Union. The geographic center of the conflict has shifted, from Europe to Asia. And this is really crucial. While the First Cold War was mainly an ideological battle, this new rivalry is playing out mostly in the economic and technological arenas.
So we end up right back where we started. Who runs the world? The final chapter is the one we're all living through right now. And the big question for all of us is this. As the world's center of gravity shifts away from the Atlantic and towards the Asia-Pacific, as new powers rise and old rules start to crumble, what kind of world are we going to build next?